So thank you everybody for joining us on what I know is not an easy time to break away from your busy week on the afternoon of a Friday. And I know there are a lot of people on their way, including some of our panelists, but we're going to try to start because we have a very, very ambitious program today. So my name is Poole-Dayan. I'm the Executive Director of Men Having Babies, a father through surrogacy. Our twins, my husband's doing the registration, one of the people doing registration there. Our twins are actually 18, not months old. And one of them is taking photos here and going to speak later as well. So this is an incredibly important event for us. We have about more than 300 intended parents who are going to join us tomorrow morning. And usually this is what we focused on a time like this, on the Friday before one of our 8 annual conferences in the United States and across the world. But what we have started doing recently is trying to look more at the context, the general picture, the advocacy aspects of what we're doing, because for the most part we started this organization as a way to fill a void, given that the guys who were looking to start their families through surrogacy didn't have a place where they could get peer advice, where they could have access to reputable and ethical providers. So that was our first focus. But over the years, we certainly got into the aspects of the politics, the ethics, things that we wanted to first and foremost explain to ourselves, things that we wanted to clarify with us and with our partners from the surrogate side when we established a committee of surrogates that helped us come up with our ethical framework. So this is just by way of how we're getting into here. But as you know, the event today is a collaboration with quite a few organizations, and it is done as part of what we call the Advocacy and Research Forum Initiative of Men Having Babies. So we do that in other places as well. But here in New York, it is, of course, of specific significance, given that New York is one of the only 3 jurisdictions in the United States where compensated surrogacy is still illegal. And in the effort to look into this and to try to modernize the bill and the approach to surrogacy in the state, we've once again been forced, in a good way, to articulate our positions and think further about what is it that make us feel so strongly that ethical surrogacy is possible and needed. But having said that, of course, we are not here to advocate for anybody to become a parent altogether, definitely not through surrogacy. What we are as an organization, and with the amazing organizations that have partnered with us, what we are about is try to make sure that those who want to exercise their rights to help other people become parents, those who want to form a family, and everybody involved in this process can do this in the most safe and protected and ethical way possible. So this is not a pros and cons type of event. We're not going to have anti-surrogacy people on the stage, so I'm not, don't evaluate the event as such. This is just an attempt for us to go from A to Z, but what is it that make us feel that this is an ethical and how this could become an ethical way to build your family. So just a shout out to the amazing organizations that are part of this or that are co-sponsoring the event. The representative from Resolve is just a little late, but she's going to say a few words later, and also Moderator panel. But the National Infertility Association has been a terrific partner in making this program possible. Of course, also Equality New York, Quad A, the Academy of Adoption and help me out, Peggy.
Assisted reproduction attorneys.
Thank you. And then Stonewall Democrats that have been terrific about trying to keep our legislators focused on this as well, and family equality. Now, there's also the Modern Family Coalition, which includes even further more organizations, and together we're going to try to push this forward for full debate and full consideration until we get to the point where nobody can say that we haven't had enough opportunity to discuss this. So, moving right along, the first thing we want to establish is, can surrogacy even, in theory, compensated surrogacy be conducted ethically? And one of the things we know that is probably one of the themes behind the scenes is that a lot of people start off by thinking of that surrogacy is a form of adoption, is a subset of adoption situations. So, of course, there's, on the one hand, reproduction, there's assisted reproduction, and then there's adoption. And laws and debates and experiences about surrogacy tend to draw from all these various frames of reference. I think of surrogacy as the most assisted reproduction. And as such, I want to start with the MVP of the surrogacy, the most valued player, which are the surrogates. And we have, so what we'll do is first, maybe we'll go very quickly and have the panelists introduce themselves to make my life a little easier, but also make you be brief. Otherwise, I'm going to be maybe offending somebody by being too brief. And then I'm going to start asking you questions and try to get along these issues. So why don't we start from the far end?
I'm Michelle Pine. I'm a board member of Men Having Babies, and I'm a 2-time surrogate.
I'm Lisa Schuster. I'm also a former gestational surrogate, and I work for Men Having Babies, managing our gay parenting assistance program.
I'm Graeme Reid. I'm the director of the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch.
Hi everyone, my name is Carla Torres. I'm the Assisted Reproduction Human Rights Policy Counsel at the Center for Reproductive Rights.
Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Sylvia Schneider-Fox. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in reproductive mental health and board member of Men Having Babies.
Wonderful. So Lisa, we'll start with you. And you've been a surrogate twice yourself.
Yes.
You work with a lot of surrogates. We help more than 20 couples directly and case manage them every year. As I said, some people just look at this and say, how could you have done this? How could you have given up a child? How do you feel about this?
I think that, when people are asking that question, they're not really looking at the process from the beginning of it. It's really not me giving up a child. It's me at the very beginning making that decision to become a surrogate and knowing throughout that entire process, which pregnancy is really only a part of that process, that it's not my baby. It's never intended to be my baby. It never had the possibility of being my baby. And so it's really just going through the process with another couple or another intended parent, knowing that you're caring for them. And so it's never even a thought that crosses or a sadness that comes along about giving up a child. It's just completing the process you set out to start.
And we have, and I should mention now that we go into some of these issues in a slightly different way at our large conference, which starts tomorrow morning. And we have one panel called Mindful Look at Surrogacy. All of you are welcome to join us for that tomorrow as well. And at that panel, we look into that and say, what are the concerns that surrogates have when they enter this process? And is one of your concerns including the fact that you're going to have a hard time relinquishing the baby?
Really my biggest concern was that I'm not going to be stuck with that baby. You go into it really knowing you're, for the most part, finished with your own family. You're not really looking to add another child to your own family. And so it never crossed my mind of, is this going to be sad? Am I going to be have a hard time not bringing the baby home for the hospital? Because I didn't want a baby to bring home from the hospital. In fact, we made that hard line in the sand. We did not want any more children, and that's, our next step was going through surrogacy for somebody else. So really the fear or the unrest that might sit with you is not about how you're going to feel not bringing the baby home, but what happens if I do have to bring that baby home.
And as we know, one of the fault lines or one of those residual effects from adoption is that some people look at surrogacy and say, how could the surrogate know how she's going to feel once the baby comes? Shouldn't we let her have another chance to make her mind finally and completely after the baby comes to the world. And that becomes one of those requests to have what's called either waiting period or a cooling off period. How do you think about the possibility that in some places you will be considered the legal parent of the child and will be asked to in a mandatory way, wait a certain amount of time before you're able to relinquish those rights?
For me, that would be really going against everything I set out to be. I didn't set out to be the parent of a child. In fact, I would feel like a terrible parent. I am a terrible parent to the children I carry because I'm not their parent. And so to kind of mandate that or to have any sort of recognition as myself being the parent would make me hugely uncomfortable with the entire process because it really is designating me as something that I don't want to be. I never intended to be that, and it's not something I would ever want.
And you can rightfully say, okay, this is Lisa. Maybe not everybody feels that way. Most of us here in the room have heard this testimony from so many people, and I've yet to hear a different testimony. But you, Sylvia, you work with dozens and dozens and dozens of surrogates, and they come to you and you have discussions with them. How much of this resonates?
I think that what Lisa describes is true pretty much across the board, and we see that both clinically and from research. Women who become successful surrogates know that they are carrying a baby for another couple, another family. And I hear all the time in my practice things like, I'm just an incubator. Or I'm just an oven. I just carry the baby for them. I hear all the time from women who come back after the surrogacy journey has ended. They will talk about the most important moment of the journey was the moment when they placed the baby with the parents and they could see the look in the parents' eyes when they got the baby. It is very clear that this is not their baby, that this is the baby of another family, and that they're doing this for altruistic reasons.
And interestingly, and as you mentioned, we will have a session here about some of the studies, and we have also studies that relate to issues such as the motivation and the feelings of surrogates throughout the process and the other parties in the journey. But more specifically, I've at least heard many times that part of the real difficult parting is not with the baby. It is with the parents.
That is true. That is true. In many, what people don't often recognize is that the primary attachment is between the surrogate and the parents, because she does come in with a desire to help another family. And the bond and the relationship that gets created is so often so close that the goodbye that is hard is the goodbye from the parents who are taking their baby home and now are moving on to changing diapers and being normal parents.
And here we're talking about, in general, about gestational surrogacy. The entire bill, the Child Parent Security Act, that is, the elephant in the room, is about gestational surrogates. And many times, including my own experience, my feeling was that it would be really easier if it wasn't genetically the baby of the surrogate. But we know that traditional surrogates many times say the same thing. So to some extent, there's biology and then there's the intent. Correct? So have you worked with any traditional surrogates as well? Or?
No, I have not worked with traditional surrogacy. In Illinois, where I'm from,
yeah, of course.
we do just gestational surrogacy. But I think the piece of the intent is extremely important here. The surrogate is very clear from the beginning that, like Lisa, she does not want to have this baby, that this is not her baby, and that she is doing this for another family. And to imply in any way or to put any kind of limitations on her makes her feel disempowered, makes her feel like her wishes are not being respected, makes her feel like her autonomy and freedom to choose what she does are not being validated.
And this is also very important when we talk about intent, that it's really, I feel at least, that if anybody was to tell me a story about a woman who decided to have a child with a significant other or somebody who's not that significant, with the full intent to give away that child later for adoption, we would all feel very queasy about that. That would feel wrong for us. If somebody was going to have a child on her own, knowing that she's going to give that child away for adoption, because there was no intention involved here by anybody, that this is an attempt to help somebody procreate. So let's look now into this from a broader perspective. And I know, so of course, this all relates to the issue of whether or not when you come to draft a bill, whether you want to err on the side of legal clarity and making sure that that intent is enshrined into the law and everybody knows where we're heading, or whether you want to be cautious with the thought that maybe the surrogate is not fully informed and aware and capable of making that commitment in advance. Therefore, sometimes they request to have some sort of a cooling off period, which is something that happens in adoption cases. So we know that many organizations have looked into this, and I was very impressed to hear some of the perspectives coming from the human rights organizations. And in particular, I would like to ask you, Carla, to talk about how you came to look into this issue, and also how you are looking into this particular issue of intent, or the timing of the determination of the fate or the identity of the baby, etc.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel. So as I mentioned, my name is Carla Torres. I lead the assisted reproduction work at the Center for Reproductive Rights here in the US, although we also engage, and if folks are not familiar with the Center for Reproductive Rights, it's an international legal organization that advocates for reproductive rights as fundamental rights, not only in the US, but around the globe. And the work that we're doing on assisted reproduction, and specifically on compensated gestational surrogacy here in the US, is part of us advocating for the full spectrum of reproductive rights and really centering the experiences and the voices of people who act as surrogates. And I know that often it is a female person who acts as a surrogate, but we use gender-neutral language to be inclusive of people who are gender non-binary or people who are trans, so we use gender-neutral language. But we, for the last 2 years, have been building our expertise on this issue and trying to understand how it intersects with the other issues that we work on, namely access to contraception, abortion, and maternal health. And we have developed a set of baseline guiding principles on compensated gestational surrogacy in the US, which are actually in the lobby if folks are interested in reading them. And the way that we arrived at these was using a human rights framing and speaking to experts on gestational surrogacy here in the US, including clinicians, academics, attorneys, ethnographers who had spoken with people acting as surrogates and really asked them about their experience. And then we were really fortunate to speak with about a handful of surrogates. Some of them had acted as gestational, others as traditional. A few were actively acting as surrogates as well, and asked them about their experience and what they would like to see in legislation that regulated surrogacy in their state. And what we learned, one of the things that we learned, to your point, Ron, is around the importance of pre-birth parentage orders for these surrogates. I think because it provides a sense of legal clarity around who is able to take legal and physical custody of the child if and when that child is born. And I think also out of a sense of fear that, as Lisa was saying, that the intended parent or parents would renege and change their mind, and then the surrogate would be left with a child that they never intended to parent. And it's one of the principles that we've included, with the understanding that it provides legal clarity to all parties, and it also does not endow the embryo embryo, fetus, or the embryo or fetus with any sort of personhood, and that none of the parties that then are granted by a court or pre-birth parentage orders have parental rights over the embryo or fetus before that child is born, if that child is born. So again, trying to understand how this issue intersects with our other issues, but also recognizes and addresses and protects the rights of all of the parties involved in a surrogacy contract, in particular the rights of the person acting as a surrogate.
And in fact, we know that here in the United States, we all feel that there's also a right for somebody to at least legitimately desire to become a parent. In some other countries, especially in Europe, that is not something that is universally, believed. You talk about from the UN standpoint, and you quote in your position that there is a right to form a family. Can you talk about this just a little bit? I mean, there's no right to succeed in that, but there's
Sure. Yes, and that's something that I think we include in our baseline guiding principles, that there is a human right to found a family, to partner, to have a family, to try and conceive and form a family if that is your idea of a family. But there is no right to say, this person here will act as my surrogate and we will try to conceive, and I have a right to have, at the end of however long that journey is, I have a right to a child at the end of that contract, so that it better protects the rights of the person acting as a surrogate if and when they decide, actually, I don't want to be a part of this contract anymore, or the right of the intended parent or parents to also change their mind. So while we want to build sort of a facilitating environment for people to access assisted reproductive technologies and to be able to legally and safely contract with a surrogate, we are not saying that by doing so you are entitled to or have a right to a child at the end of the contract or the journey, whatever terminology we choose to use.
Thank you. And by the way, these guidelines, and in fact, I think the more detailed PDF is in part of our recommended reading or related reading portion of the event page. We're going to add more, articles or positions there as people might suggest. And there's a tiny URL link on the program if you want to be able to have access to that. So, Michelle, one of the first things that you've been involved with at Men Having Babies was this committee that helped us draft helped us draft the ethical framework. And of course, surrogacy is legal in New York. It's just that people don't think, at the time, the legislator thought that it's not okay to compensate surrogates. And we put a lot of thought into that. Can you take us a little bit through the thought process when we try to understand what is surrogacy compensation for and why is it okay?
So we state that the compensation is for the disruption, the discomfort, and the risk to the surrogate and her family. So there is significant disruption to your life, just of having to go to different appointments and having to monitor your schedule around medications and things like that. There's obvious discomfort in taking medications and in being pregnant. As much as somebody might love being pregnant, there is discomfort in there no matter how good it is. And then there is also inherent risk to any pregnancy and any birth. And again, I've stated that that's for the family as well. So there is discomfort and disruption to the family when mom's gone to appointments and can't pick up kids, or mom's pregnant and can't pick up little babies. So that disruption and discomfort goes to the whole family, and that compensation is for that. We're very clear that it is not for the child. So it is regardless of the outcome and should be compensated throughout the entire journey. Lisa mentioned that it's not just the pregnancy, there's a lot before that, and compensation should be happening for those discomforts and disruptions and risks that happen prior to a pregnancy and throughout any pregnancy, and if it ends unfortunately early, which sometimes it does, you're still compensated for the time that you were pregnant and those discomforts, disruption, and risks that happened during that time.
And of course, we've been looking further into also trying to adjust how compensation is done in real life to this. But basically, how would you describe your experience? You've also done a survey among a large number of surrogates, how they feel about the compensation. How would you describe what you think is the general norm about how surrogates feel about the compensation?
We did a broad survey, and now I cannot remember how many people there were.
300 plus.
Yeah, that sounds right. It was a couple years ago. And looked at how much they were compensated for each step along the way and kind of how that format came out, whether it was all at once or kind of divvied up along the way and how it was divvied up. And kind of the rhyme and reason that came out at the end of that was that it didn't matter how much it was, it had to do with the journey. So if your journey was terrible and you didn't connect with the IPs and they were disrespectful or something, it didn't matter if you were compensated at the higher end of the scale. And if things went well and you had a smooth journey, it didn't matter what the compensation was. It was much more about feeling that you were compensated for those three things along the way.
And in fact, it is our belief that the only person who can quantify, what is the monetary value of the amount of disruption, discomfort, and risk that they are encountering themselves is the surrogate herself. We don't think it should be something that's outcome of market forces, but certainly a lot of issues. Once again, we talked about adoption and surrogacy kind of like mixing up, and here there's a lot of terms from a different framework of labor, of workplace, where people, in English we often say, who did you work with? What was, what? And we use a lot of terminology that comes from the workplace in day-to-day life as well, even if it's not commercial settings. But we know that surrogates de facto are not being compensated for a talent. There is no such thing as a more talented and less talented surrogate. There is no such thing, as we mentioned, as compensation for the quality of the product or the quality of the service, or even, none of that is part of this. These are all terminologies from the workplace that don't belong in here. So I want to move on to you, Graeme, and alongside with the International Women's Health Coalition, you guys have been working hard. Can you tell us a little bit about how you looked into this aspect of surrogacy and some of the insights about how to look at this and what you concluded regarding the compensation in particular?
Certainly. So I'm going to talk briefly about a very specific intervention, and that's the fact that the UN is looking into the issue of surrogacy. And we recently, in May of this year, made a joint submission to the relevant special rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children, addressing several issues relating to surrogacy. One of the main ones is around the issue of compensation. And I see the relevant quote is included in the pamphlet here. And I'll just read the relevant section. It says, people acting as surrogates who, of course, may do so without remuneration or compensation, but also may receive compensation that constitutes fair recompense for lost wages and other opportunity costs, healthcare and nutrition expenses, and restitution for the significant burdens and risks associated with pregnancy. And in our submission, we say that such arrangements do not and should not, in and of themselves, constitute sale of children under the optional protocol. So at Human Rights Watch, we work strictly within the confines of international human rights law, and so our submission outlines the parameters of law as it pertains to surrogacy. And the second main point that I wanted to emphasize in our submission was that while we recognize that children born of surrogacy are obviously crucial rights holders whose human rights must be considered in any discussion of surrogacy and whose best interests are the primary consideration in all matters affecting them, nevertheless there are intersecting rights at stake, and they also need to be taken into consideration, and specifically the rights of surrogates and would-be parents. And our submission primarily addresses those rights in recognition of the fact that the rights of children have been significantly addressed in prior reports by the Special Rapporteur. I won't go into detail about that. Carla has already mentioned the rights of founding a family and exercising reproductive rights. We looked at 10 areas of human rights that are implicated, including, I won't go through them all, but including the right to equality and non-discrimination, bodily autonomy, reproductive autonomy, and again, the right to found a family. And in conclusion, we say that there are risks of abuse in surrogacy, and clearly it raises complex legal and ethical issues. And the solution to the problem is not to ban surrogacy, but for surrogacy to be practiced under a framework based on international human rights law that incorporates the rights of the child, of surrogates and potential surrogates, and of people seeking to become parents through the use of surrogacy and other forms of assisted reproduction. You could find the full submission on the Human Rights Watch webpage. If you just Google Human Rights Watch surrogacy, it comes up, or the webpage is hrw.org.